Welcome to Nobody Told Me. I'm Jan Black.
And I'm Laura Owens. On this episode, we welcome psychotherapist and best-selling author Lori Gottlieb to the show. Lori is the author of several books, the latest of which is called Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, A Therapist, Her Therapist, and Our Lives Revealed.
Lori, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
Your latest book takes readers into both your therapy office, where you see patients, and into your own therapist's office, where you landed after a crisis. Tell us more about how the book came about.
So it wasn't like I woke up one day and said, I'm going to write about my experience in therapy.
Right.
It was very much, I was supposed to be writing a different book, which was a book about happiness. And I was just starting out my career as a therapist. And the more I saw what was going on in the room and in people's lives, the more I felt like the book that I was writing wasn't really getting at what I wanted to say about the human experience and what we all go through and what our struggles are like. And so I thought I would rather bring people into the therapy room and let them see firsthand what was going on. But I also felt that it would be a little bit disingenuous if I showed what was going on with my patients, but I didn't really present myself as a normal human being, that I was the expert up on high. And I really wanted to show that we're all more the same than we are different. And the only way I felt I could really do that was by bringing people into both experiences.
You say that your greatest credential isn't your degrees or your years of training, but the fact that you're a card-carrying member of the human race. I love that. Why is simply knowing what it's like to be a person, struggles and highs and everything that we go through, your most coveted skill?
I think because ultimately what we're doing is connecting with people in the therapy room, and we're holding up a mirror to them and helping them to see the ways that maybe they're not aware of, that they're creating more difficulties in their lives than they realize. And I think that you have to have a certain kind of relationship and trust in order for that process to be effective. And so if I don't know what it's like to sit on the other side of that room, if I don't know what it's like to want my therapist to like me, if I don't know what it's like to feel ashamed of something that I may have done, if I don't know what it's like to self-sabotage, then I won't know what it's like for my patient. And so I think it's really helpful to be able to say, I know what it feels like. I know what pain feels like. It might not be your pain. Your pain might not be my pain. But we all know what it's like to just be a person in the world. And I think that that's really important, because this profession is very much about our humanity. And if you don't know what it's like to be a person, nobody wants to go and talk to a brick wall. Nobody wants to go to the person who, either hasn't really experienced life or doesn't really want to engage with the person on a human level.
And tell us more about the crisis that landed you in a psychotherapist's office.
Right. So, I talk about how the presenting problem, the thing that we come in with, is often the crisis that brings us there, whether it's, something at work or something in our relationship or something with our child or whatever it might be. But often it has to do with something deeper that has been going on for a long time. So in my case, I was in a relationship where I thought that we were going to get married, and that's what we had been planning and talking about. And then out of the blue, my boyfriend tells me that he doesn't think he can live with a kid under his roof for the next 10 years, that kid being my 8-year-old. And this came as a complete surprise to me. And all of a sudden, everything that I had thought was going to happen and that I thought was true about our relationship and our future pretty much disappeared. And so that's what landed me there. But what I learned is that a lot more was going on.
I'm wondering what your expectations were from your therapist when you went there, just knowing what it's like to be on the other side.
Yeah, I think that when you go to therapy as a therapist, it's kind of like a little too much information might be dangerous, meaning that you don't want to be backseat driving. You don't want to have your therapist hat on. You just want to be there. And as my friend who was a therapist who said, maybe you should go talk to someone. She said, you need to go someplace where you can just be not be a therapist. You need to go someplace where you're just yourself. And that's exactly what I tried to do in that room. And in terms of my expectations, though, because I wasn't the therapist in that room, I had really skewed expectations. And my expectations were, I just need some crisis management. This was a big, shock to the system here. And I just need a few sessions to kind of understand this better. And I really wanted the therapist to basically validate my experience and say, yeah, he's a sociopath, and that's not what the therapist did. And if I had my therapist hat on, I would know that that's not what the therapist would do. But I didn't. And I think that that's the difference between talking to your friends about a problem and going to see somebody who doesn't have an agenda or who doesn't want to make you feel better, but who really wants to help you see something that maybe you're having trouble seeing.
Now, tell us about your therapist, Wendell. What's he like and why did you choose him?
Well, I chose him because when you're a therapist, it's very hard to find somebody who's not already in your world. So, I have colleagues in my suite at work. I have colleagues in my consultation group that I go to every week, which is where we discuss cases. I refer to people refer to me. So those people are all off limits. It needs to be a clean relationship. And that's very hard to do when you're ensconced in that universe. And so I actually called a colleague of mine and told her that I was looking for a therapist for a friend.
Good one.
And this was the person that she ended up referring me to, and it was someone that she had trained with. And he was not in my orbit at all, which was what I wanted. And so he was very different from me. He was, first of all, I was starting out and he was much more experienced. His style was very different from mine. He felt very, I would say, himself in the room. He had boundaries. He wasn't crossing any lines or talking about his personal life, but he very much brought his personality into the room. And that was something that I ended up learning from him to do myself as a therapist. But when I first met him, he seemed like he came sort of from Therapist Central casting, the khakis and the
exactly what you would expect,
and the stoop posture. And, he seemed like, I think I describe him as a kind of a cross between a wise elder and a stuffed animal, and, as I get to know him, my impression of him changes over time. And I think that happens with everyone. I'm sure that when people come to see me, they have a certain experience of me the first time they meet me, and that will change over time.
We're thrilled to have you as part of our Nobody Told Me family, and we want to tell you about one of our sponsors, Smart and Sexy.
Smart and Sexy is the place to go when you've made your plans for spring break and now you need to figure out what to wear.
The people at Smart and Sexy know that not everyone has the same wants and needs when it comes to swimwear, but no matter what your shape or size is, you want your swimsuit to accentuate your assets.
And that's why Smart and Sexy designs fashionable swim pieces that highlight what you love most about your body. Bra-size swim tops to lift in shape, minimum to full coverage bikini bottoms, and flattering one-piece suits that look good on every body type.
The best part, you can get the looks you want without going broke. Smart and Sexy swimwear is all under $28 and comes in over 50 sizes. Even Triple D bikini tops and tankinis are only $20 to $28.
But you can do even better than that. Right now, Smart and Sexy is offering Nobody Told Me listeners 30% off their first order. Just go to smartandsexy.com to find your new favorite swimsuit and get 30% off your first purchase with promo code Nobody Told Me.
That's smartandsexy.com, promo code Nobody Told Me for 30% off today.
Did you find yourself editing out any information about what was really going on in your life when you talked to Wendell because you were afraid of him judging you? Because I know that's a common thing when people go to therapy, that they're afraid about being completely honest because they don't want the therapist to think one thing or another about them.
Absolutely. I think we tell our stories in a way that we want to present ourselves, not because we're being deceitful, but because I think that we're invested in the version of the story that we come in with. So when people come into therapy and they tell me their story, I'm not just listening to the content of the story, but I'm listening to their flexibility with the story. who are the major characters in the story and who are the minor characters. Like I come from a writing background, and I almost feel like sometimes I'm an editor sitting in the therapist chair. Is the protagonist moving forward, or is the protagonist moving in circles? If we ask the other characters in the story to tell their version of the story, how different would it be from the version that I'm hearing? So I don't think that people are intentionally trying to deceive. I think that what they're doing is they're very invested in seeing a story through their perspective, and it serves them, it protects them in some way. And what we do as therapists is to say, let's zoom out a little bit. Let's look at the story from other angles, because I think it will help you. And so we don't have to feel so much shame around the other versions of the stories. We can say we can use them in a constructive way. And that's something that I don't think you get anywhere outside of the therapy setting, where someone will actually go through that process and look at your story with you in that way.
Did you find that you were telling a certain version of your story?
Absolutely. And in the book, I go through these various stages of confessing, both to the reader and to Wendell, of a lot of things that I rationalized to myself were not really relevant. I don't really need to bring those up. Certain other things that were going on in my life that I felt like, well, really, I'm just here about the boyfriend situation. I don't really need to, everything else is fine. Everything else is fine plus, except that it wasn't. And I wasn't ready to acknowledge that or look at that, because I really wanted to focus on the crisis at hand.
Is it almost always a crisis that brings someone to visit a psychotherapist?
Well, when people come to see me, I'm always curious to find out, why now? Why this day, this week, this month did you pick up the phone and decide to come in and talk to me? Because sometimes they'll come in because something just happened. And, the usual things, something happened with their job or their relationship or their child or whatever it might be. But sometimes people come in because something feels off. Something feels just not quite right. Or there's a feeling of stuckness and they don't quite know why or what to do about it. So both situations present themselves. But I think in both cases, the same work gets done, which is, let's find out what's going on. Let's really look at this in a way that maybe you haven't.
What are the universal issues that you see patients struggle with in your practice that can make people seem like they're polar opposites on the surface, completely alike?
I think that at our core, we all want to be loved. I think we want to connect. I think that we are terrified that if we tell the truth of who we are or show the truth of who we are, who we fully are, that people won't love us. And so I think that so much of what we do is protective. We do things in the service of, I think, these polarized ideas of fear and love. We act out of fear and we act out of wanting love. And I think in the middle there are things like, how do we value ourselves? What is our self-worth like? And self-worth, different from self-esteem. What I mean is self-compassion. One universal that I notice so much is how unkind we are to ourselves. Mm-hmm. How often the voices in our heads we're like bullies to ourselves so much of the time. And we would never tolerate that from an outside person in our lives treating us that way. But sometimes if we really listen, we can be so unkind to ourselves. And one of the things that I try to help people do is to hear what they're telling themselves and how that holds them back in all areas of their lives.
And you've said that often people keep their pain inside because they worry it's not big enough. And we have a mental health crisis in the country partly because people don't feel comfortable talking about their pain, so they act it out in dangerous ways. What do you think society should do to change that, to make us feel more comfortable about talking about the emotional pain we may have inside?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think that we live in a culture of, stiff upper lip and, really your pain has to be, it's almost like it's compared to other people's pain. And I talk about in the book this concept of the hierarchy of pain, that there is no hierarchy of pain, that pain is pain. And so I worried at first, when I was treating a young woman who was in her 30s and she was diagnosed with cancer, that I was worried that going from her to somebody who would say something like, well, my husband never initiates sex, or the babysitter's stealing from me, that somehow that I would devalue their pain or minimize it. Mm-hmm. But I didn't. And in fact, I think that it taught me that people's pain really is their pain, that at the core, going back to your earlier question, the question of, the husband who might not initiate sex is, this feeling of rejection and how horrible that is. What does it mean that am I loved? And the question about the babysitter is this person that I trusted with my child, how do I trust again? How do I trust when this person that I entrusted with the thing that's most important to me might not be trustworthy? So I think that they come down to these core issues that are much more significant. And so a lot of times people will say, well, I'm sad, but I'm not look at my life. I have all these good things. I don't really have a right to be depressed. I don't really have a right to feel bad. Or why am I depressed? I don't have any reason to be depressed. But you are. So you can't will away your feelings. Your feelings are there. And also, if you don't deal with them in some way, they get bigger. It's almost like if someone had a heart condition, if they were like, I'm feeling some chest pain, but I'll just wait until I have a heart attack before I go to the doctor. You would never do that, right? But with our emotional health, if we are feeling the equivalent of chest pain, we say, oh, well, it's not that bad. I'll just muddle through it.
You talk about a case that you had that is so serious, a patient named Rita, who told you that if her life didn't improve within a year, she was going to end it. And I'm wondering, how do you deal with a patient who is at that low of a point in their lives? Because that's so serious and you want to help them, but I just don't know what steps you would take.
Yeah, and I think that her story is a really important one, because I think that there's this question I think people have about, is it ever too late to change, and how hard it is to change, especially as you get older and you have more history and more decisions have already been made. And I think in her case, she had so much regret about how her life had been lived up to that point, and her 70th birthday was coming up, and she said, if my life doesn't get better, I don't think I want to live it. And I think that she came to therapy at a point in her life when she was willing to make change. And that's a really interesting idea, which is that sometimes people land in therapy when they're finally ready to make a change. And I think she was. And so I think that, when people resist change and they resist it and they resist it until finally they say, I can't live this way anymore. Something has to change. And usually that something is themselves. And we help people figure out, what it is they need to do to change.
You do a column called Dear Therapist in The Atlantic, and on your website you have some of the columns that have been especially popular. And I wanted to talk about one of them. You discuss spouses who threaten divorce during arguments. Tell us more about that.
So somebody wrote into the column about what happens when this couple, when they fight with each other, and it's about it usually devolves into this, we should just split up, or I'm going to get a divorce, or something like that. And I really talk about, why that person is doing that. What is the underlying message of that? And I think it's, it's like emotional terror. It's like an emotional terrorist saying, if you don't do this, then I'm going to leave. And I think what I'm trying to say in the column is that, first of all, threats never got anybody. If you want to be loved, threatening somebody is not the way to do it.
Good advice.
If you want someone to come closer to you, criticizing them is not the way to make them come closer to you. And so I really talk about sort of, the way that we try to get love versus the way that people actually can get the things that they want. How sometimes we do the exact thing that will guarantee our unhappiness. And that's one of them. So I really try to point out in the column, it's an advice column, but I don't give advice like, no, you shouldn't talk to your mother-in-law anymore. The advice is really about how a therapist might think about your dilemma, and so that you might think about it differently and might make a different choice.
Yeah. And along those lines, I love how you say that ultimately therapy is about taking responsibility for our own lives, shifting from the idea that hell is other people to the reality that sometimes and often hell is us. we can change our circumstances. And I'm wondering how you get your patients to come to that conclusion, even though so many of us, myself included, resist the idea that they are the problem a lot of the times and only they are the solution.
Yeah, well, the reality is that the world is filled with difficult people. That is true, and many of them, share our last names. And so, it's not that there aren't external circumstances that are making their lives difficult, but their response to the circumstance is making it harder. So a lot of times, they don't realize that they're engaging in a certain pattern. That if they would, step out of the dance that they're in and do a different dance step, the person that they're engaged with will have to do a different dance step too, or they'll simply leave the floor. And so I want people to realize that they have much more control over their lives than they imagine, that there's so much that they can do to change their circumstances that don't have to do with the usual things people come into therapy with, which is help me to get this other person to change. That's usually how people come in. And I'll say, well, let's talk about how you can change. And people don't like that very much. I didn't like that very much when I went to my therapist, and that was exactly what he was saying to me. But change is hard, and the reason we resist change is because with change comes loss. That even with positive change, we have to give up something that we covet, which is familiarity. So even if our current circumstance is miserable, at least it's familiar. But when you change, there's the uncertainty of the unknown, of the new thing that you've never experienced before. And you're like a stranger in a strange land. And all of a sudden the customs are different. The language is different. The mores are different. You don't know, you feel out of place. And that's what makes change so hard. So, I think those two things are going on. One is realizing that you're going to have to change, and then realizing that change itself is really hard for a lot of us to do.
What advice do you have for people who are struggling with strained family relationships? Maybe they have been estranged from their parents or their children, and they'd like to mend fences. What do they do?
Right. I just got a question like that in the Atlantic for the Dear Therapist column, where a parent wrote in saying that, he wants a relationship with his adult daughter and they're estranged and he doesn't know, he's tried reaching out to her, but not getting the response that he wants. And I really explained to him that I think sometimes people want something from the other person as opposed to getting curious about the other person's experience. And in this case, I think the parent really wanted forgiveness from his child. And really, that was going to be his job. He was going to have to forgive himself, and he was also going to have to understand more about her experience and what she was so angry about. Instead of trying to convince her that he loves her and he's sorry for what he did, he needs to really understand why she's so injured, why she feels so hurt by him. And if you don't have a curiosity about the person that you're, estranged from or having difficult relationship with or having conflict with, you're going to get nowhere. You need to be curious about the other person's experience. And so often what we want to do is we want to tell the person how we feel. We want to say, here's how I feel about our relationship. Here's how I feel about you. As opposed to, tell me what's going on for you. How are you feeling about what's going on between us? Or what have I done that might have made you not want to be around me?
What are your thoughts on using couples counseling or group counseling for families who are trying to work through issues within their relationships rather than seeking out individual counseling?
I think couples counseling I do a lot of couples counseling in my practice, and I think that people learn so much about themselves because in individual therapy, like we were talking about earlier, you're hearing one version of a story. Mm-hmm. But in couples counseling, you're not only hearing both sides of a story, but you're seeing it in real life. You're seeing it in real time. So you see, this is how they interact with each other. This is what happens when he brings up something, she cries. Or when she tries to talk to him, he stonewalls. Or, whatever happens. You see what happens. And so I think it's really effective to see these patterns in real life and to be able to point them out as they're happening, as opposed to, here's what happened yesterday or last week, but here's what's happening right now in the room. Let's stop right here.
What advice do you have for choosing a psychotherapist?
Well, study after study shows that the most important factor in the success of your therapy isn't the therapist's training, area of expertise, number of years they've been doing this. All of that matters, of course. But what's most important is the relationship you have with your therapist. So you might need to shop around. And I think some people aren't aware of that. They think, well, I'll just go to this therapist, and even though I'm not really feeling it, I'll just keep going back.
Yeah.
If you're not really feeling it, that's information. And the information is useful. You can say to that therapist, and people are embarrassed. They feel like, well, I don't want to hurt the therapist's feelings.
It's like breaking up with somebody.
Right. But it's not, in the sense that therapists are used to this. We get it. We don't want you to come to us and feel uncomfortable because you won't get the help you need. And so we understand that, you might feel better with someone else, and we want to help you find that person. So you won't hurt our feelings if you want something different. And so we always want people, if they're not feeling like this is the right match for them, to say, hey, I don't know why or what it is. And maybe there's something that is going on that they would feel with any therapist, and we can talk about that and see if that improves. And sometimes it does. Or maybe it's just not right, and we can say, hey, let's see if I can refer you to someone, or you can find other referrals yourself. And it was nice to meet you, and I hope you find the right person.
Can you tell us one of your favorite stories during your time as a psychotherapist? And maybe that's one that you've talked about in the book.
Yeah. I think I tell this story in the book about my very first therapy session, which is as a therapist, which is I'm doing my internship, and I've never been in the room alone with a patient before. And, we've always, it's a weird profession, because when I was in medical school before this, we had this saying, see one, do one, what was it? See one, do one, or see one, learn one, do one, or something. And it was basically, you watch someone do something, you try it yourself. Oh, see one, do one, teach one. You watch someone do it, you try it yourself, and then you teach someone else how to do it. And with therapy, you can't sit in the room and watch someone do it. So we would see through, we'd watch through glass sometimes. We would watch sessions in real time, or we would watch videos of sessions. But we were never in a session by ourselves until we were actually in with a real live person. And I'm in this session, and this person comes in, and she tells me right away, within the first 30 seconds, that she's really, really, she can't stop crying, and she doesn't know why. And then she bursts into tears. And it wasn't just like, she starts tearing up and then she starts crying. She is, it's like a tsunami. And this wasn't how it went in the trainings that we did in graduate school. I really want to help her, but I have to get this information. It's an intake, and I'm supposed to get all of this information about, her background and all this historical information. And there's a form that I have to fill out. And it's really hard to do when someone's hysterically crying in front of you and you don't want to interrupt them and you don't know what to say to make them feel better, which at that point I thought was my job. And so the session goes on, and I'm not getting the information, and I'm trying to understand more about this person and her life. And then I look at the clock because I need to know how much time we have left. And it looks like only 10 minutes have passed. And I think to myself, well, surely more than 10 minutes have passed. I feel like we've been here, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes, 30 minutes. And then a couple of minutes later, I look again at the clock, and it hasn't moved. And I realize the battery is out in the clock. And I have no idea how much time we have left. And I know that I have a new person waiting for me right after this.
Oh, my God.
And maybe that person is in the waiting room, but I don't know. And I have no idea how much time has passed in this session. And I don't have my phone in the room with me. And I can't very well ask her to go look at her clock as she's, tell her phone is, all this is happening. And so I just keep going through the session. And then finally she says, oh my gosh, it's almost over already. That went so fast. And I turn to where her eyes are, and I look behind me, and there was a clock on the wall behind me that was working. And it turns out that she knew the whole time how much time was left. And so, that was this really embarrassing story. And it wasn't how I imagined my first session would go.
Yeah.
But I learned a lot in that session. And part of it was about just, my supervisor said, you just need to be honest. And you can say, hey, the clock isn't working. I need to go get a new one. I'll be right back. And I wasn't comfortable enough to do that the first time. And it takes a while to really understand what it's like to be a therapist, what it's like to feel the rhythm of a session, to kind of know in your head how much time has passed, and to know that you can be yourself in the room and you can say, oh, look, the battery must be out. I want to make sure that we use our time well here. Let me go get another clock.
Your book is called Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, and I'm wondering what suggestions you have for people who have a family, friend, or relative who maybe should go talk to someone.
I think that there are a lot of misconceptions about what therapy is, and I think one of them is that you're going to go to therapy and people are going to make you talk about your childhood and unpack all this stuff that you don't want to unpack, and that you'll be there forever. And it's just not true. People come to therapy to learn more about what's not working in their lives, and as therapists, we want to get you out of there as quickly as possible, meaning we want to see you suffer less. And we don't want to see you suffer for, a long time. So there's no shame in going to talk to somebody. There's a lot of value in that. Some people might think, well, it's a weakness that, something's wrong with me that I have to go talk to someone. And I think really it's a strength that you realize that, something isn't working in your life and you want to go get help with it. That's a sign of strength. That's a sign of having agency over your life. And so I hope more people will see it that way and not think of it as something that has a stigma attached to it or that it means something negative about the person who's going.
And Lori, as you know, our show is called Nobody Told Me, and we always ask our guests, what is your Nobody Told Me lesson? So what is it about humanity and, just life in general that you wish you'd known when you first became a therapist?
I wish I'd known that everybody struggles to some degree, no matter what it looks like on the outside. And I think that sounds really obvious. People, I think, will say, well, of course I know that. But I think we don't live that way. I think so often we look at life kind of pressed up against the glass, looking at other people who have something that we think that we want. And we make up stories about their lives. And I think if we can focus more about, on our lives, and not make those comparisons, because those comparisons are always in somebody else's favor and they're erroneous. So I wish that somebody had told me that my life isn't that different from everybody else's life at its core, no matter what our lives look like on the outside. We all want the same things. We all struggle with, at our core, the same things. And also, I think that a lot of people have more compassion for us than we realize. And if we can have more compassion for ourselves, we would be doing ourselves a great service.
And Lori, how can people connect with you on social media and the internet?
They can find me at my website, which is lorigottlieb.com. And they can also find me on Twitter at lorigottlieb1.
There are so many more questions that we had for you, and we wish we could talk to you about.
I know,
for hours, but we'll have to have you back another time. So thank you so much for coming on the show. Our thanks to psychotherapist and best-selling author Lori Gottlieb, whose latest book is called Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, A Therapist, Her Therapist, and Our Lives Revealed. And again, her website is Lori Gottlieb, GOTTLIEB.com. I'm Laura Owens.
And I'm Jan Black.
And you've been listening to Nobody Told Me. Thanks for joining us.